I have enough light?
Yes, you're good.
Okay.
All right. Uhuru, comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Akila Anai, Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. Today's study is highly important, and we encourage you right now to share the stream, invite your friends and family to it, so that as many of our people can be involved in this discussion as possible. This week, the chairman reads chapter 2 from the book Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. And you can find the study materials in the Facebook and YouTube descriptions. We are initiating a series where we will be showcasing the practical work of our party tied to the theory of African internationalism. We have, over the last few weeks, been discussing the importance to unite theory with practice, and we in the party have a saying, it's not what we say, it's what we do. The party has existed for 49 years, and since our founding has not only brought revolutionary theory to our struggle for African liberation, but has established actual processes, protocols, practices, and institutions to help us achieve our revolutionary aims. We have been laying the foundation of a liberated African economy and government of a united socialist Africa. In this chapter, Solving the Problems of the Revolution, we learn how the African People's Socialist Party solved these outstanding problems left wide open with the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s. It is my honor now to introduce our leadership, the leader of the African nation and the worldwide African Revolution, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru. I want to thank you so much, Comrade Director Akile. And this is an important study. As you mentioned, right now, over the last few weeks, we've been going through the political report, variations of the political report, either to the 7th Congress of the party or the political report to the first plenary of the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. And we're doing this right now. We've been doing it for a number of years, but it has some special significance at this moment where the imperialist system, where the white power system, where the entire world economy that has come into existence is as a consequence of our enslavement and colonization and the colonization of so much of the world. Is in a state of severe crisis. The crisis has been here for a while. We've been talking about the crisis, in fact, for a number of years. And it is now making itself manifest to everybody in the entire world in a way that was not necessarily anticipated in the form as it is in terms of this colonial virus that people are having to deal with. But some irony is the fact that we were prepared in so many ways for this moment in history as a party, and that we will come out of this. In fact, we are stronger now as a consequence of the way this crisis of imperialism has made itself manifest through this colonial virus. We are stronger now than we were even before. In many ways, we are leaner. We have certain kinds of contradictions that we obviously have to deal with. Our institutions, our economic institutions are under a severe stress, but they still exist. And they exist because they are not just the institutions of the African People's Socialist Party, and certainly they do not belong to any individual, but they belong to the people. They are African people institutions that are connected to the ongoing struggle of our people to unite and liberate Africa and African people throughout the world. And more of our people and people who are in solidarity with our struggle are coming to the rescue, coming to support of these institutions, because these are institutions of an incipient, independent political economy of Black people, African people, of the African nation itself. And therefore, many people can recognize their own interests in these institutions and will do whatever is necessary to make sure that these institutions survive. These are not just some kinds of institutions. These are not self-serving institutions. These are not institutions that's owned by any individual, that makes any individual rich. These are institutions that have been created to further the aims of our revolution. They're visible. You can see them. We show them on a regular basis so that people can recognize, you can recognize, whatever resources you've contributed to this process. You can see where they're going concretely. These are not wishes. These are not just empty promises that we are making about we're going to do this and that. We show you what's happening, and you can walk into them. You can walk into our institutions in St. Louis. You can walk into our institutions in Oakland, California. You can walk into our institutions in Philadelphia. You can walk into our institutions in St. Petersburg. You can walk into our institution in Huntsville, Alabama. You can walk into our institutions in Houston, Texas. And increasingly, you'll be able to do that in various places around the world. So we are stronger now, and we are getting stronger every day. And this process we're involved in now in terms of the political education is an aspect of the growing strength that we are accumulating as a party and as a people. We're doing this study today, and that it's going to have to be something done rather expeditiously, because I want to get through the study, because next week we intend to present to you the concrete manifestation of everything that we've talked about. So it's not just going to be theory as such. It's not just going to be a report on something that's written. We will bring to you the concrete manifestation, the stuff that people like to see in terms of the evidence of who we are and what this party is. And sometimes it's necessary for us to do this for members of our party and our movement as well, because as I mentioned, we are tied down in so many aspects of works, so many things, so many projects right now, that sometimes the projects themselves overwhelm our consciousness, and we don't remember that these are projects that we are involved in, that are part of a overwhelming, an incredibly magnificent movement for liberation. It's tied to a much larger project than just what it is that we're doing. So next Sunday, we'll begin the process of showing you that in a very concrete way. And I want to go ahead and get into the study, but I think that what I must say, it's really important to say. I talked about how the party in many ways was ready for this colonial virus, but because we are ready for colonialism itself. We're ready for the for the fact that we are involved in preparing to take our freedom from this horrible monster that has imposed its will on Black people and the peoples of the world now for going on for 600 years or more. And we've been preparing for this. We didn't prepare for a virus because we don't have a virus problem. We have a colonial problem. We have a problem as Black people, as African people stretched across the globe, first of all, of colonial domination. Initially by white people, white power, that itself is being shaken. A part of the crisis of imperialism is that this white power is losing its grip on its capacity to dominate us and the rest of the peoples around the world. And they see that, they understand this contest as being between them, perhaps, and China, or them, in some instances, and Russia, them, on some occasions, Iran, something like this. But I'm here to say that the fundamental existential problem, existential crisis of this social system is Africa and African people, the struggle that we are engaged in for liberation, and that the African Revolution is the critical factor, is the critical ingredient in the total defeat of capitalist domination of the world, colonial capitalism, and that for the first time in history, the African people who are oppressed and dominated around the world has its own revolutionary working class party. And the working class, the African working class, which stretches across the globe. In fact, essentially, we are a nation of workers. We have been forced to be a nation of workers. We have obviously had to labor in our own interests since time immemorial, but since our collision with imperialism that's changed the history of the world, with our collision with colonialism, white power, we have been mostly relegated to workers more than anything else. All across the globe, we've had to labor. And unfortunately, we've not labored for in our own interests as people. We've labored for the interests of the imperialists, for the empire, for the colonialists, for the white power, for the white people, if you will. And this is the fundamental contradictions that we've been confronted with. So we are a nation of working class people. We are in the process of consolidating our national liberation under the leadership of the African working class, our responsibility in part. And one of the reasons that we do these studies is because we are aware, brothers and sisters, you are members of the party and our movement, that we have to, that a fundamental aspect of our struggle is to elevate the consciousness of the African working class, so that the African working class is conscious of its own selfish interests and is conscious of its historical mission to overturn colonial capitalism. And the African working class stretched across the globe is being brought into consciousness of our responsibility to liberate Africa and African people, unite African people around the world. And this is the critical ingredient in the destruction of capitalism on an international basis, on a world basis, which is necessary for the advent of socialism, which is a new social system that can only come about as a consequence of the defeat of capitalism. And that's what we are about. So I want to just say some things. I want to go into the study right now, and I'm going to try to be expeditious because I want to get through this study so that on next Sunday, we can give you the best demonstration that you could hope for, that the African People's Socialist Party, that finally the African working class has risen to its full stature. It has its own revolutionary party that's leading the struggle and that has resolved many of the contradictions that we've been confronted with since our encounter with imperialist white power. So we'll start now with chapter 2. And this is from the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party. And that was held in 2018. And the title of the political report in book form is Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution. And this is chapter 2 that we want to deal with on today. So chapter 2, our party solved the problems of the revolution. The African People's Socialist Party was born in the heat of struggle, at a time when the US government was bent on destroying the Black Revolution of the 60s. Together with the heroic revolution of the people of Vietnam against US colonial occupation, the Black Revolution constituted an existential threat to imperialist white power. The freedom movement of African people within current US borders had broken from the absolute leadership of the liberal sector of the African petty bourgeoisie and was fighting to become one with the anti-colonial movement sweeping the planet. All the peoples of all countries wanted freedom from the capitalist parasite that had come into existence through colonial slavery and dominated the world. The Chinese, Korean, and Cuban revolutions had ignited the imaginations of oppressed peoples everywhere. Capitalism had been born as global white power and defined itself as such. The world capitalists had previously predicted their own invincibility as custodians of the planet. Many of the oppressed had also been convinced of this until the revolutions of oppressed peoples achieved universality and shook the imperialist world to its foundation. Africans within the US were affected by this escalating scope of anti-colonial revolutions. Many were forced to reevaluate the definition of our struggle in the US as simply one for civil rights within the existing social system. We began to recognize the struggle for civil rights as being rooted in philosophical idealism and patriotism to the very system and people responsible for our oppression. My own personal political history began to solidify during this period of anti-colonial upheaval. I was fortunate enough to have been born during the era when anti-colonial struggle was the main trend in the world. These revolutions resulted in political independence for India. That was 1947, followed quickly by the success of the Chinese Revolution of 1949, an era that was reshaping the economic, political, and ideological contours of the world. I was therefore thereby able to envision a future shorn of white colonial domination. To have been born during this period, it was where the people in India and China appeared to be achieving freedom from white power. White power blanketed the planet Earth. Everybody was under total white domination. And then to see, to be born during this period where people in India were struggling, of course, immediately against British domination, where the British, they had killed millions of people in India to dominate that territory. And the Chinese made an incredible revolution in 1949. To be born during this period, to see this kind of activity of national liberation movements around the world had to affect my consciousness and people of my generations, whether we were looking for a revolution or not, but it had destroyed the notion of invincibility of white people and white power. It had contributed to a kind of recognition, as subtle as it may have been, of the ability of people who were not white to be free and to control our own lives. So my personal political development initially moved me to join the US military, and an ill-informed youthful attempt to extricate myself and my future from the prevailing blatant white domination in the southern US city of my birth. I found that the US Army was a reflection and guardian of the injustices I attempted to evade through my enlistment. As a consequence of my struggles in the military, I was grudgingly granted a discharge. I was granted a discharge because I was leaving. I created such a disruption in the military that both of us found it to be better if I were no longer with them. Shortly thereafter, I found my footing in the organized resistance by joining the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, a youthful and dynamic front of the civil rights movement that was responsible for raising the slogan demand for Black Power in 1966. When I was in the military, let's be clear, I was engaged in serious struggle inside the military. And it was because of this serious struggle inside the military that the military decided that I shouldn't be there. I had already decided I shouldn't be there, and was engaged in forms of resistance inside the military that pushed them to give me a discharge, to discharge me. So the Black Power demand put SNCC on a collision course with the US government and with the liberal sector leaders of the civil rights movement, leaders who owed their success to their relationships with sectors of the white ruling class. SNCC became a target of the colonial state, but events were moving too fast to immediately contain the growing anti-colonial radicalization of the African population within current US borders. In Florida, I was jailed for my political activities in St. Petersburg and Gainesville, and sentenced to a 5-year prison term at the end of 1966. At the same time, in Oakland, California, the Black Panther Party, influenced by SNCC work in Lowndes County, Alabama, exploded on the scene in dramatic fashion. The terror of the counterinsurgency unleashed in the US, by the US colonial state within US borders, was laying waste to most of the anti-colonial resistance. The Black Panther Party was a primary target because of its explosive growth and influence among the most oppressed sector of the colonized African population. I was also constantly in and out of prison because of similar work, primarily in Florida and Kentucky at the time. It was during one of my frequent prison stints that it became clear to me that the era of protest politics was over, that our people had to really fight for power. We had to have a political party, the most effective vehicle for capturing and wielding power. Black power had to be translated as our own Black state power. By 1972, when our party was formed, the Black Revolution of the 60s was on its last leg as a generalized expression of organized mass struggle. The Black Panther Party, which had borne the brunt of the domestic assault by the US colonial state, had lost most semblance of a revolutionary organization. Many of its leaders had been jailed, exiled, and killed, and others, after years of assault and eventual political isolation, were driven into a paranoid political immobilization. By this time, the Black Panther Party had little semblance of its former self. Party's Oakland years revived the African Revolution. The African People's Socialist Party took up the gauntlet. In 1986, 3 years before his death, Huey P. Newton, the founder of the Black Panther Party, who once achieved international stature as a prominent revolutionary leader, stated at our Uhuru House in Oakland, California, of one of his last public political speeches, and I quote, "You might not have the Black Panther Party, but you have the Uhuru House. You might not have the Black Panther newspaper, but you have the burning spear. So they really haven't done anything by crushing one organization," unquote. Indeed, the existence of the Uhuru House in Oakland, California, which at the time was the international headquarters of our party, was part of our work to resuscitate the African Revolution. Newton was only able to have a venue and an audience for his statement because of our party and the movement we had created in Oakland, where the US was already performing dirges marking the demise of the US-based African liberation movement. Our party was organizing resistance to the criminal charges being pressed against Newton by the colonial state at the time. His presence at the Uhuru House was due to our insistence that he fight back. We assured him that we could bring the people to his defense from ridiculous allegations associated with the school the Panthers once owned that had been destroyed by fire, ignited probably by the US government. The African People's Socialist Party led the campaign to bring Huey P. Newton back into political life in Oakland. When he was assassinated in 1989, it was we who organized the mass resistance against attempts by bourgeois colonial media to slander his name into political revulsion and irrelevance. It was our party that supported Newton's widow after his assassination, and we who obtained the mortician that presided over his funeral. It was the African People's Socialist Party that organized the honor guard of uniformed members of our party at the public viewing of Newton's body, attended by more than 10,000 people. We printed the program for his funeral. While the official funeral happened at a major church in Oakland, it was our party that held the mass people's funeral outside the church, conducted by Oakland party leader Comrade Biko Lumumba from atop a party van surrounded by thousands of working class Africans who could not get to the church. We also led the spontaneous funeral march of thousands that accompanied Newton's hearse at the conclusion of the official ceremony. The participation of the African People's Socialist Party in the funeral of Huey P. Newton was a continuation of our work in Oakland. and was a concrete transition in a historical moment. The African People's Socialist Party was the rising revolutionary force, the current advanced detachment of the African Revolution, providing an honorable, if belated, departure for the leadership of the past. The presence of the African People's Socialist Party in Oakland influenced the consciousness of our people in our movement for liberation. Our decision to reclaim the definition of Newton and the Black Panther Party transformed the colonial narrative and changed the course of history. And it's important to comment on this because the government and its media attempted with the assassination of Newton to defame Newton and the Black Panther Party, and in the process of doing that, to undermine, to smear the revolutionary project that he had been central to during the moment of his revolutionary life. And so the objective was not just Huey P. Newton that the government and the media wanted to attack. It was an assault on the whole struggle for national liberation that the government and its media was involved in. And our party stepped in and did not allow them to do that. And there's not enough time now to go through the whole struggles and things that we did to make that impossible. The demonstrations that we led, the massive propaganda that we were responsible for, the fact that I made the determination to our party that, but after Newton's assassination, and I learned of it earlier than most people because Comrade Bakri in Oakland, California, who is a nurse, was at the hospital in the early morning hours when they brought Newton in after he had been killed. And he called me immediately that Newton was there and that he was dead. And so we moved right away and we called a meeting and determined that by the time of Newton's funeral, it would be we, the African People's Socialist Party, that will have defined who Newton and the Black Panther Party were. We said that, we would do that. We would take that definition out of the hands of our oppressors. We would be responsible for doing that. And we went to work, not the so-called retired Panthers, not the so-called alumni, none of the others who were associated with the Panther Party before took this on. We did this. We changed the whole course of history. We turned Oakland into a real symbol of the resistance of the Black Panther Party, the Black Revolution, as a consequence of the activities of the Black Panther Party. There was no place where you could go in Oakland and you would not find the stencil silhouette figure of Huey P. Newton standing with the shotgun that had become so iconic during his lifetime. There was no place you could go in Oakland where you did not see something that was upholding the memory of Huey P. Newton and the Black Revolution of the 1960s. We held the demonstrations, etc. That was a dynamic that over a whole period of time, the police had to take from the streets. They disappeared from the streets of Oakland because of the activities that we were involved in. The people began to stone the media and who came out to the site where Huey had been assassinated and as an act of defiance and revitalized consciousness that we had contributed to awakening in Oakland, California. So we say that the presence of the African People's Socialist Party in Oakland influenced the consciousness of our people and our movement for liberation. Our decision to reclaim the definition of Newton and the Black Panther Party transformed the colonial narrative and changed the course of history. We defeated the efforts by the colonial ruling class media to characterize Newton by the last difficult years of his life when he had succumbed to the decades of jailings and repression that successfully isolated and demoralized him, reducing him to the stature and habits of too many of our colonized brothers and sisters during the height of the counterinsurgency in the US. On the morning after the announcement of his death, bourgeois colonial newspapers described Newton as a quote unquote bum and critical. His epithet as written by our hated class enemies and national oppressor. On the same morning, our party held rallies at the site of his assassination and showed videos of the heroic days of the Black Panther Party when it had been the revolutionary center of our movement. It was our party that held the march that led hundreds of Africans through the streets of Oakland, deserted of all domestic occupying military forces, chanting, "Who killed Huey? Don't tell no lie. The government, the FBI." Without the intervention of the party, the state, and its media would have succeeded in the attempt to demean the movement of African liberation by discrediting Newton and the Black Panther Party. Left to their own devices, the hated imperialist rulers would have created the myth that they detested Newton because he was a bum and a criminal, and not because he led an incredible liberation movement that raised many working class African people from the depths of the social, spiritual, and political morass created for us by US colonial capitalism. And of course, what we've seen since Newton's death. I mentioned that none of the so-called retired Panthers or the alumni and what have you was in the mix. It was we, the African People's Socialist Party, that took this on. There was some really self-designated heroic leaders of the Black Panther Party who showed up to his funeral, some of them in disgraceful way in terms of attempting to profit from his funeral. There were some who intervened to try to block the party's support of Newton's widow. Actually came to the Uhuru House to meet with me and members of the party to try to prevent us from supporting Newton's widow, slandering her and what have you. This is what some of them were doing, but our party took it on, and we raised the resources and took resources on a regular basis to Newton's widow after his assassination, even in the face of all of this. So we said that although the attempt continues to be made to define Newton outside of his role as a leader of our struggle against colonial capitalist domination, our party rescued the definition of our anti-colonial struggle from the poison sewer of white nationalist contempt that rose up with Newton's assassination. And there were some people who have come to be recognized as heroic members of the Black Panther Party, and who wouldn't even come to Oakland, California, even though they had lived there at one juncture and left Oakland after a dispute with Newton. They wouldn't even come to Oakland, California, as long as Newton was alive. And then they showed up, and subsequent to this, to Huey Newton's death, they have begun to rewrite history to themselves, to promote themselves as the real figures who was providing leadership despite all of the errors of Huey P. Newton, et cetera. And that's nonsense, because we know them, and we knew them then, and we didn't see them then. And the only time they showed up was with the funeral of Huey P. Newton. And they were highly diminished figures at that time. So we said that it was only because the African working class and our colonized nation had an advanced detachment, a revolutionary party that functions as the general staff of our struggle for national liberation, unification, and socialism, that the colonial rulers were unable to rewrite our history of revolutionary resistance. The revolution continued to exist after the demise of Newton and the Black Panther Party. The revolution continued to exist in the form of the African People's Socialist Party. Party has always functioned as the advanced detachment. It is a law of dialectics that the old must give way for the new. This applies to the dynamics within our anti-colonial movement, as well as a dynamic between our liberation struggle and the parasitic capitalist system. This is why we are not intimidated by what appears to be the strength of our colonial capitalist oppressor at the moment. All evidence exposes the reality that US bluster today is the anxious braggadocio of symptomatic impotence. the bluster of an imperialism in decline on its deathbed. We never tailed the masses as did so many others. We exposed the bourgeois selections of Nelson Mandela and Barack Hussein Obama as the imposition of neo-colonialism, even when the masses wanted them to represent a victory for the African people. The African People's Socialist Party always led, even through periods when our positions were temporarily unpopular, until the truth of the party's analysis revealed itself to the masses. We have always fought to defend the anti-colonial revolution of the African nation. We have always functioned as the advanced detachment of our nation and class, dragging our struggle to new heights from the depths of defeat. There were others who organized different events around any number of issues during this period. Some were repudiating past commitments to revolution, and for some, coalition building became the buzzword of the way forward. The African People's Socialist Party, our organization, was determined to solve the problem of the revolution. Our people and our movement needed a revolutionary party of steel cadre, guided by revolutionary principles and advanced revolutionary theory. We had to fiercely fight to build the party of the African working class, the only social force capable of leading the struggle of African national liberation, unification, and socialism to a successful conclusion. That's why we're still here nearly 50 years later. That's why this heroic young comrade who is presiding over this discussion this morning, who is the Director of Agitation and Propaganda, Akilia Nai, is who she is. She's standing on a foundation of a real serious cadre creating party, steel cadre. And she is that steel cadre. And she's been here even as others have come through our ranks and had to be dismissed or have run away, frightened, unable to live up to what was called for by the revolution at the moment, experiencing the crisis of imperialism as their own crisis, as opposed to seeing this crisis as something that the revolution could take advantage of, would take advantage of, under the leadership of the advanced detachment of the African working class and the African Revolution, which is the African People's Socialist Party. The African working class, under the leadership of its own revolutionary party, conscious of its own selfish interests, and guided by the revolutionary theory of African internationalism, had to lead our struggle for victory over colonial capitalism and usher in a new world free of class exploitation and human oppression. That's what it was about. I want to say that again, because some people, comrades, who do not know us very well, only see different manifestations of our movement in this organization or that organization, in this campaign or that campaign, but they have not been able to pull it together. We're going to help them with that next week, and see that our mission is bigger than any particular campaign that we're involved in. And again, we are saying the African working class, under the leadership of his own revolutionary party, conscious of his own selfish interests and guided by the revolutionary theory of African internationalism, had to lead our struggle for victory over colonial capitalism and usher in a new world free of class exploitation and human oppression. That's what we're about. It's not just about that little situation in Everton West in South Africa, or that situation that we might be confronted with in Over the Hill in Nassau, or the situation that we might be dealing with in North St. Louis. But our objective is to lead the struggle for victory over colonial capitalism and to usher in a new world free of class exploitation and human oppression. That is the task that the African working class has assumed. It's a historic class. The working class has assumed this responsibility and recognition of its historical mission. And its party, the African People's Socialist Party, has assumed responsibility to take this class consciousness into the ranks, the struggles, the motion of African people all around the world, so that the working class can stand up to full stature and step in front, as it should, as the advanced detachment, as the vanguard, with the historical mission of overturning all evidence of capitalism and colonialism, and again, creating a new world, a socialist world, which is, of course, the early stage of communism. Comrades, the advanced detachment understands that revolution is not an event. It's not an event. It is a process. Revolution is a science and an art that requires for its leadership advanced revolutionary theory and a disciplined organization of professional revolutionaries. Revolution is a science and an art that requires for its leadership advanced revolutionary theory and a disciplined organization of professional revolutionaries. My political report to our 6th Congress, An Uneasy Equilibrium, spoke to the party's work to maintain the life and direction of the Black Revolution of the 60s. And I'm quoting here: since the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 60s, the masses of the people have been sidelined, pushed out of political life. What passes for struggle is relegated most often to single issue activism that is nothing but an appendage to social media militancy. Let me say that again. What passes for struggle is relegated most often to single issue activism that is nothing but an appendage to social media militancy or liberal and other bourgeois schemes. The significance of our party lies in the fact that we have never surrendered or deviated from the path of the same African revolution that motivated the imperialist white power attacks in the 20th century. We continue to lead despite the general setbacks suffered by our movement as a whole. We are the only organization that correctly analyzed the fact that the Black Revolution of the 60s was defeated by imperialist counterinsurgency, a military attack intended to keep our people and our movement from ever rising up again, unquote. Comrades, brothers and sisters, delegates to the 7th Congress of our party. When our party came to Oakland, it was not in anticipation that we would be there to fight for a dignified departure of Comrade Huey P. Newton. We did not go to Oakland to preside over the passage of an era of Black revolutionary struggle. Our presence in Oakland was a natural consequence of the party's growth and our determination to complete the Black Revolution of the 60s. Our political track began with the founding of the African People's Socialist Party, an act which in and of itself raised our struggle to a higher level, even as the US government was confident in its success in destroying it. In 1972 in Florida, when the Black rights fighters of Fort Myers and the Gainesville Black Study Group joined with the Hunter militant organizations JOMO to form the African People's Socialist Party, we were working to build the inaugural African Liberation Day mobilization schedule for May 27th in Washington, DC. That was in 1972. Our participation in the subsequent African Liberation Day mobilization from that point on has been to continue the revolutionary trajectory of our movement while that was being effectively crushed by US imperialism within its borders. Solving the problems of the revolution. The task of solving the problems of the revolution meant that we had to resolve the host of organizational, political, and theoretical contradictions blocking the progress of revolutionary development. And this was not a small thing. It's not a small thing. And we experienced the consequences of our inadequacies politically, organizationally, and ideological throughout the world. We saw it with the same kind of civil rights consciousness that led Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana to independence, based on principles, among other things, of nonviolence and We saw Nkrumah, of course, was able initially to get away with this nonviolent form of protest and get the British to concede for independence to Ghana. But what has been not recognized that much is the influence that the struggle that the British were having with the Kenyan Land Freedom Army, Mau Mau. And it was an organization that was not based on philosophical nonviolence at all. It was armed struggle that tied up the British Empire for years and years. And of course, the British murdered more than 300,000 African people in Kenya to put it down. But we saw Comrade Nkrumah, who was influenced in part by W.E.B. Du Bois and the Pan-Africanist movement that he had created to contend with the struggle by Marcus Garvey, who also was a big influence on Nkrumah. Nkrumah has said that Garvey was really an eye opener for him. Having read Garvey, it was part of what set him on his track. But the weakness ideologically, politically, organizationally, you can see that with Nkrumah. Nkrumah did not even understand the class question until after he was overthrown. And the fact is that people in his own party deserted him because of the kind of organization he had, the kind of party. It was not a party of the Advanced Detachment. It was not a revolutionary party. And so these cowards and treacherous forces who came from the petty bourgeoisie that had been created by the British, by world capitalism, they deserted Nkrumah. And we had the same thing with Patrice Lumumba, who initially had some of the same assumption that there could be a nonviolent ascendancy to leadership in the Congo. He was a courageous, incorruptible force that attracted admiration of oppressed peoples and especially Africans around the world. But his organization, he did not have revolutionary theory. He definitely was opposed to the capitalism and the domination of Africa by Europe and the rest, and by Europe in particular. But his organization, once members of his organization, Mobutu, was somebody that Lumumba had appointed as leader. He was in Lumumba's own party, and Lumumba had appointed him as leader of the military. And he was the one that was the instrument used by the American government and Kennedy and Eisenhower and the Belgians and French and what have you to overthrow and then murder and butcher Lumumba as if he were a cattle or something to that effect. So we had organizational limitations. We had ideological limitations, limitations in theory and what have you, affected our ability to make this struggle the way it should have been made. And those are just a couple of the examples that we're talking about. So we say that our organization response was the creation of African People's Socialist Party, an organization of professional revolutionaries as a necessary vehicle for advancing the interests of our nation under the revolutionary leadership of the African working class. That's an organization response. Without the development of the party, with the development of the party, we open up new fronts of struggle throughout the African world. Theoretically, the party opened up a major offensive against outdated, failed philosophical worldviews and vigorously advanced struggles against the hostile ideology of the colonial oppressor class and its devotees within our colonized community. We made determined struggles against philosophical idealism. This included incessant ideological war against the definition of our struggle as being against so-called racism, which can only be an effort to perfect the system of oppression by changing the minds or feelings of white colonial oppressors And it also is something that validates the system of oppression by saying that the only thing we're fighting for is not the system itself, but to be included in the system, to be somehow liked by the colonizers. This has included an ideological offensive against religious obscurantism and various expressions of mysticism, and the notion that our liberation will result from speeches by some individual genius or the discovery of secret documents that once received would automatically confer freedom upon our people are not so secret documents like the Constitution, like something other instrument that the bourgeoisie has created as a means by which they can keep the struggle of oppressed people within the parameters of the system itself. The theory of African internationalism necessary for the success of our revolution was developed to provide an ongoing guide for our struggle in the wake of the demonstrated inadequacies of organized, practiced, idealist, and metaphysically influenced Marxism that did not recognize the centrality of parasitism and the colonial question. As the advanced detachment, only we have been able to spread our theory and grow our political influence through the publication of our 50-year-old political journal, the Burning Spear newspaper, read by thousands of Africans and colonists throughout the world and within the brutal colonial prison concentration camps. Our internet radio station, Uhuru Radio, and the 2 FM radio stations, Black Power 96.3 and 100.1, owned by constituent organizations of our movement, enhance this work of anti-colonial socialist party propaganda. Solve the problem of African unification. Another problem that had gone unaddressed since the US government's effective destruction of the Garvey movement in the early part of the last century was the question of African unification and liberation. Africans can be united globally once again under a single leadership with a single center. Like Garvey, we know that a liberated and united Africa can only occur under a single revolutionary organizational leadership. Like Garvey, we know that a liberated and united Africa can only occur under a single revolutionary organizational leadership. We passed the resolution calling for the establishment of the African Socialist International, ASI, at our first Congress in 1981. But our work to build the unity of the International African Liberation Movement preceded this Congress by many years. We organized the first US-based support committee for the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, that at the time in the early 1970s was engaged in armed struggle against the white settler regime of Rhodesia. We also led much of the work of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania during its early stages in the US, placing staff in its New York United Nations office and sponsoring and escorting PAC leaders to events in the US, many of which were organized by our party. We spoke at the United Nations and participated in several demonstrations. We spoke at the United Nations and participated in several demonstrations there in support of the PAC. We reprinted many of their publications for their use in propaganda work. Our efforts to win ZANU and PAC leadership to formal participation in the African Socialist International were unsuccessful. Our party pursued the efforts up to the point when negotiated settlements resulted in transfer of direct political power from the white settler colonialists to African neo-colonial custody in the form of ZANU in Zimbabwe and the African National Congress in occupied Azania. The transfer of direct political power to the African petty bourgeoisie revealed the ideological weaknesses of ZANU and PAC, leading them to abandon their efforts for revolutionary seizure of real African worker peasant power, instead functioning within the neo-colonial state structure previously utilized by the white settler colonialists of Rhodesia and South Africa. Party brought political and economic together as one. From its inception, our party united the struggle for political independence with concrete work to build African economic self-reliance through programs of dual and contending African working class power. We have always known that the political and economic are one. Who created the decades-old economic institutions to teach African anti-colonial self-reliance? It was we who organized Ujamaa Restaurant in Florida in 1972, and African Connections bookstore in Louisville, Kentucky in 1979. We opened the first African-owned commercial newspaper and later a bookstore and record shop in Gainesville, Florida, even as we built Spear Graphics and then Uhuru Bakery Cafe in Oakland in the 1980s. Throughout the years, we have never been without our own independent economic infrastructure, committed to ensuring that our party would never be economically beholden to anyone or anything that would demand political adherence to another worldview. Uhuru Foods and Pies was born in Oakland in 1980 and is still growing today. The dynamic Uhuru furniture stores in Philadelphia and Oakland continue to thrive after nearly 30 years of operation. The party established a nonprofit entity, the African People's Education and Defense Fund, APEDF, to host community programs in defense of the human and civil rights of the African community. APEDF today encompasses Uhuru Furniture and Collectibles, the African Independence Workforce Program, and other economic programs of the party created over the past three or more decades. We have built dynamic Uhuru houses with their Aquaba halls in St. Petersburg, Florida, Oakland, California, and now St. Louis, Missouri. We created Black Stars Industries that includes Uhuru Foods and Pies, Planet Uhuru Apparel, One Africa, One Nation Marketplace, Burning Spear Publications, and other institutions that comprise the foundation of a liberated African working class economy as an expression of dual and contending power. In the early 2000s, the party formed, I just want to say that because from time to time, we hear about a new scheme that is created by somebody for some kind of economic program that's supposed to contribute to easing the pain of African people here or someplace else in the world. Our party, and sometimes they've even called it something like dual power, which is a concept that we put forth in the 1970s as a part of the strategy to win our liberation. We said dual power. We're not talking about creating some kind of power, some kind of economic or other institutions that is to exist side by side with imperialist white power. We talk about dual and contending power. The objective is to initiate a process of achieving power, building power, while that serves the purpose not only of speaking to the needs and aspirations of our people, but in the process of so doing negates the power of our oppressor. Our objective in creating these institutions is a part of a process of creating our own independent anti-colonial economy, and anti-colonial economy not in the hands of the African working class, in particular through the leadership of its Advanced Detachment, the African People's Socialist Party. So that distinguishes us, and I wanted to make that point because you've heard, as comrades in the party, we sometimes talk about how we see these manifestations of these different schemes, and they are essentially reformist schemes because the objective is not to overturn the social system and our relationship with it. The objective is to somehow initiate processes which in theory are designed to ease the pain or and give pride to our people who are living under colonial domination. They are not set up. They do not have as a part of their function the negation of the power of the oppressor. And no matter, and the reason we can say this about what we do is because these are not some institutions that are just there. These are institutions that are instruments of the revolution under the leadership of the African working class through its own independent revolutionary political party, its Advanced Detachment. In the early 2000s, the party formed the All African People's Development and Empowerment Project, APDEP, to bring African skilled scientists, engineers, and doctors with into organization under the leadership of the African working class. APDEP opened Zenzele consignment in Huntsville, Alabama. Let me see, the struggle for national liberation is what all of us are engaged in, some consciously, some not so consciously. And it is a struggle that encompasses the whole African nation. You know, there are compradors and sellouts who are tied to imperialist white power who will kill us and destroy us. And they have done it in different times in history. And not just a long time ago, but relatively recently, we are aware of that, who betrayed the revolution in every instance. As a social force, the African petty bourgeoisie. African petty bourgeoisie as a social force will always betray the revolution, despite the fact there are individuals who are from the petty bourgeoisie that will commit class suicide and will abandon the interests of the petty bourgeoisie and unite with the interests of the African working class. And we've seen that with some outstanding figures. So we've seen it in Cuba with Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. We've seen it in China with Mao Zedong. We've seen it in various other places by forces like that. Look at in Guinea, Guinea-Bissau with forces like Comrade, come on, help me with this, comrades. Guinea-Bissau, comrade, I see his face. He was an agronomist. He was one of the few educated Africans there who helped to build the revolutionary process there. So individuals from the African working class have occasionally abandoned the interests of the African working class and united with the interests, abandoned the interests of the petty bourgeoisie and united with the African working class. That's committing class suicide. Amir Cabral is who I was thinking of. And so, but as a social force, the petty bourgeoisie will always betray the revolution as a force, as a social force, as a group. But we are engaged in a struggle for national liberation that embraces the interests of the vast majority of the nation, whether they are petty bourgeoisie or workers. So that is something that always happens, that the struggle that we engage for national liberation. So we've seen struggles for independence, if you will, all over the continent of Africa. And the petty bourgeoisie was usually the leadership of the struggle for independence, with the exception of, one exception, of course, that stands out is with the Kenyan Land Freedom Army, Mau Mau, under the leadership of Dedan Kimathi, which was mostly a peasant-based and peasant and working class-based revolutionary movement. Inside the struggle for national liberation that embraces the interests of all the people, the struggle of the African working class is the central driving force, because the African working class is the only social force that can destroy the social system itself. So the African petty bourgeoisie, as we've seen, have led struggles for independence that have not changed the conditions of African people at large, except perhaps to take them deeper into a state of exploitation than they were even before, when we lived under direct colonial white power, such as in South Africa and other places that we can talk about. So people feel proud that now the white man is no longer obvious and the Black people are leading us, it seems. But as long as the white power will control the economy, we were still being dominated, and there was no struggle to unite all of Africa, because the African petty bourgeoisie has no interest, no matter what they say it has no interest in uniting the whole African nation, destroying the borders, because if they do that, they destroy the incubator from which they are reproduced on a regular basis. They are reproduced within the class is reproduced. The African petty bourgeoisie is reproduced within the confines of those false borders that have been created by imperialist white power. It is only we, the African working class, that has no stakes in the existing social system, and that social system is held up in part by these borders that have been created that separate Africans from each other and from our resources, etc., and that is a basis for the recreation of the African petty bourgeoisie, a social force that benefits from that relationship. The working class, that's the future. That's what we understand. So now we're talking about the working class now moving, even as we engage in the struggle for freedom, for liberation, we're moving to create the economic infrastructure that would be owned and that is owned and controlled by the African working class in the form of its advanced detachment, the African People's Socialist Party. In the early 2000s, the party formed the All African People Development and Empowerment Project, APDEP, to bring Africans, skilled scientists, engineers, and doctors into organization under the leadership of the African working class. APDEP opened Zenzele Consignment in Huntsville, Alabama, consignment shop that functions as an ongoing resource generation institution for the organization. Zenzele will function as the headquarters of APDEP, where the community can shop and volunteer, and where the organization's national and international projects can be showcased. For the past 8 years, Deputy Chair Omali Yeshitela has headed up the party's economic front, catapulting our existing institutions into a new level of success with a growing list of economic entities. Our 7th Congress, taking place in part at our latest Uhuru House in St. Louis, Missouri, is simply a continuation of our history for leading by example as the Advanced Detachment. We are practical revolutionaries. This is why we initiated the Black Power Blueprint, a major project that is helping to transform the entire African colony of St. Louis. We have renovated the 9,000 square foot building that was a community eyesore just a few months ago on a major thoroughfare. It was a property like so many in St. Louis waiting to be added to the list of gentrified booty for the array of realtors and investors that perennially lurk in the shadows, working with financial institutions, government officials, and neo-colonial sycophants to undermine our community to a status of uninhabitability as a prelude to moving us out. Instead, with the determined direct leadership of the Office of Deputy Chair Omali Yeshitela, we are advancing dynamic economic initiatives. When we say that politics is concentrated economics and that the political and economic are one, we mean exactly what is being demonstrated in St. Louis. The pending St. Louis Uhuru Bakery and Cafe is part of the Black Power Blueprint plan, along with the intended workforce development program to train Africans who have been given felony convictions by the colonial state and prison system that are used to lock Africans out of employment possibilities. The amazing array of economic institutions developed and or led by the Deputy Chair Omali Yeshitela are consistent with our party's drive to pursue, by example, the ongoing 600-year-old struggle against foreign and alien domination of African people. Party made reparations a mass demand. Another problem solved by our party was to give reality to the demand for reparations that had been talked about within the national liberation movement for generations. It was we who took the reparations demand out of the straitjacket of purely legal and legislative approaches. We are the organization that gave the reparations demand a mass and concrete character. We deepened the theoretical and political basis for the demand and began the practical process of acquiring reparations that made it a reality and not just wishful thinking. When our party began this work, the so-called reparations movement was only considering compensation for African colonial slavery. It was we who recognized that the rate of exploitation of Africa and African people has grown greater since the formal end of our legal enslavement. The existing reparations movement of today bears the imprint of the work of the advanced detachment of the African working class and forcibly dispersed nation. It bears the imprint of the African People's Socialist Party. It was we who made the reparations demand a mass demand of our people. In 1982, we formed the African National Reparations Organization, ANRO. ANRO held reparations tribunals throughout the United States for 12 years. In fact, most of the noted reparation activists of today gained their reparations involvement and experience through a direct or indirect relationship to the work of our party. Only the advanced detachment would be able to use the political device of international law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Only the advanced detachment would be able to use the political device of international law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, given the right of oppressed peoples to bring their case before the bourgeois world court. Only African internationalism could inform us of the necessary conclusion that reparations are owed because of parasitic capitalism and our stolen labor, land, and resources. Our understanding that the reparations demand is a function of the revolution allowed the party to open a serious front among the colonizer population. Through the reparations demand, we are able to win thousands of so-called whites to conscious participation in the assault on white nationalist colonialism. For some, their introduction to active political life was and is in the reparations work created by the party, created by and led by our party. Our party solved the problem of white people. It is our party that took the mystery out of the question of white people. We brought the definition of white people down to earth, destroying the myths of biological and religious determinism. We advanced the often unpopular declaration that white people are people whose behavior can be explained by a scientific, historical, materialist analysis. We resolved the outstanding question of white people in a practical way with the formation of the African People's Solidarity Committee, APSC, in 1976, the organization of whites working under our leadership with the strategic assignment of collecting reparations from North Americans to forward our struggle for African national liberation. We resolved the outstanding question of white people in a practical way with the formation of the African People's Solidarity Committee, APSC, in 1976, the organization of whites working under our leadership with a strategic assignment of collecting reparations from North Americans to forward our struggle for African national liberation. Party built revolutionary mass organizations. The African People's Socialist Party created mass organizations that made it necessary for us to abandon, that made it unnecessary for us to abandon our revolutionary trajectory in order to win non-revolutionary masses to the revolutionary politics, program, and leadership of the party. See, some organizations, after the defeat of the revolution, some individuals and organizations emerged who may have been around or may not have been around, but with the conclusion that somehow, since the revolutionary period was over and the revolution had been defeated, they don't say defeated, but was over, that what we had to do was start by just bringing the people in some kind of civil rights stuff again. That's what this whole Black rights, Black Lives Matters, and this is one of the latest iterations of that whole stance that you gotta, somehow you go and fight for civil rights, you can't make the revolution. We say we have to make the revolution. And the party is the vehicle for making the revolution. But in the process of making that revolution, we recognize, because we are historical materialists, we understand that there's a difference in where we are now and where we were in the 1960s when a high tide of revolutionary struggle. So what the revolution does is not go back to the 1950s and start doing civil rights. We say our objective continues to be to make the revolution, to liberate and unify Africa and African people around the world, but we have to also create the venues, the avenues through which working with African people who are not revolutionaries, who have not come to revolutionary conclusion, who have been terrified by the consequence of the defeat of the revolution, open a door so that they can come into the process led by the revolutionaries with the revolution still on the agenda and highest on the agenda, and bring these people from where they are to the revolution through these different doors that we will open to make that happen. So that's why we said the African People's Socialist Party created mass organization that made it unnecessary for us to abandon our revolutionary trajectory in order to win non-revolutionary masses to the revolutionary politics, programs, and leadership of the party. Politically, we initiated various campaigns and relationships to defeat the US counterinsurgency and protect and advance the interests of the African working class that had suffered the brunt of the defeat of our revolutionary movement. The African People's Socialist Party led major campaigns to recognize and free many of the political prisoners who fell during the counterinsurgency when imperialism was most determined to destroy any semblance of resistance. Pitts and Lee, Al Courtney, Connie Tucker, Desi Woods, Angela Davis, Huey P. Newton, Frida Drumgo, George Jackson, Sundiata Acoli, Assata Shakur, the San Quentin Six, Republic of New Africa 11, Freddie Lee Roberts, Mafundi Lake, and myself are just some of the people we defended and sometimes freed when their arrests and imprisonment were being used to crush the revolution and the spirit of the people. At a time when there was no other organized African response, we formed the African National Prison Organization, ANPO, in 1979, which we created as millions of Africans were being caught up in the net of colonial mass incarceration. There's a lot of stories. There's a big story to that, but we won't go into that. In 1991, the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, NPDUM, was formed in Chicago to fight the counterinsurgency and defend the democratic rights of the African community. NPDUM waged countless campaigns to defend and free African political prisoners and prisoners of war, as well as thousands of victims of colonial police violence and murder. We formed the African National Women's Organization, ANWO, in response to the oppression of African women and as a vehicle of the party to bring masses of African women into political life, our party, and revolution. So we're talking about all these different things that they're not just out there by themselves. These are entities and campaigns that were launched by the party, and all of them launched by the party to bring more people into the revolutionary project under the leadership of the Advanced Detachment to make our revolution. An excerpt from the political report to the Fifth Congress stated quite simply, ANWO will become the powerful home to African women who are constantly under some form of assault by a myriad of contradictions peculiar to African women. ANWO would provide a mass organization for women who need to confront their oppression and exploitation. It would allow the party to develop a reserve for the revolution through helping women to recognize the universal contradictions confronting our people and class that are located in the specific contradictions they are confronting as women. Party's legacy of internationalist solidarity. As a Vanguard party representing our party and nation, we have stood unconditionally with the struggles of colonized peoples around the world. We have always demonstrated practical unity with the people of occupied Palestine in their righteous struggle to liberate their land and people from the illegitimate white settler colony of Israel that functions as a forward military base of US imperialism. Even before the success of the Iranian national liberation from US neo-colonialism in 1979, our party had occupied picket lines and hosted forums and events designed to expose and fight against the US-backed regime of Shah Reza Pahlavi. We encountered violent mass white colonial opposition in the US to our organized support of the Iranian people following the seizure of the US embassy in Tehran by Iranian militants. July 1979 was also the time of the defeat of the US-supported Somoza regime in Nicaragua by the Sandinista National Liberation Front. Without waiting for an invitation, the African People's Socialist Party organized many public political forums in the Northern California Bay Area in support of the Sandinista-led revolution, even before the fight and temporary escape of Somoza from his bunker in Nicaragua's capital, Managua. Our party functioned as part of the US front of the Sandinista movement. In the 1970s, the African People's Socialist Party entered into a brief relationship with the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, PRSP. We participated with the PRSP in a 1,000-strong mass anti-colonial mobilization in Philadelphia in 1976. Shortly after, the party organized the first World Tribunal in reparations for Black people in the United States in Brooklyn, New York. We were in Belfast, Ireland, where we developed unity with the Irish Republican Socialist Party with our struggle for national liberation from US colonialism. The Irish Republican Socialist Party organized a joint press conference with our party to publicly announce its support for our demand for reparations to African people. This allowed our party to denounce British colonial occupation of Northern Ireland and express our support for Irish resistance and the revolutionary liberation of Northern Ireland. In 1985, the party entered into an enduring fraternal relationship, an alliance with Unión de Barrio, a most influential component of the Mexican national liberation movement. Some of these relationships were formed during a time of extreme backwards race nationalism within sectors of the African national liberation movement. It was a time when there was a common refrain that the international relations we were establishing were white too. Some insisted that our movement could not establish alliances and relations with others until, quote unquote, we get ourselves together. And whatever that meant, beyond the demand that the African working class remain isolated and of course dependent on the African petty bourgeoisie. We are African internationalists. We have always recognized the importance of uniting with all the peoples of the world in the fight to overturn the parasitic system of colonial capitalism that has the world in its death grip. We have always been committed to international solidarity. We refuse to accept the isolation demanded by the African petty bourgeoisie. We have always taken the strategic approach that anti-colonial struggle anywhere in the world is part of our struggle to defeat US imperialism and parasitic capitalism. Uhuru. Comrade Akile.
Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru.
Uhuru, so I want to salute our leadership. Usually we have an audience and you would be able to hear all this round of applause for the chairman, but I'm going to do my own. Uhuru, Chairman, thank you for that powerful study. It is now time to open up with questions from our audience and online viewers, and we want to appreciate everyone who is tuning in right now via Facebook or YouTube, and also appreciate your engagement from throughout the study. Please continue to invite your friends and family to this study. Doesn't matter that, you know, it's 9:22 Eastern time. Still continue to bring your family and friends into this discussion and share, because people can watch, you know, after the study concludes. And yeah, so now we're going to get into our questions and comments. And we want first, as we always do, want to acknowledge where people are watching from. We have Spokane, Washington, Louisville, Kentucky, St. Louis, Missouri, Kuwait, occupied Azania, Gainesville, Florida, Riviera Beach, Florida, Houston, Texas, St. Louis, Missouri, Houston, Texas, Chicago, Illinois, Sierra Leone, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, St. Petersburg, Florida, Hempstead, New York, Israel, Atlanta or occupied Palestine, Atlanta, Georgia, Huntsville, Alabama, Brooklyn, New York, Lagos in Nigeria, the Netherlands, Clearwater, Florida, Fort Myers, Florida, Trinidad, and Newark, New Jersey. Those are all the forces that checked in. So we did get a lot of comments. I'm going to jump right into one of our questions, coming from Comrade Nasir in Kuwait. Says, Uhuru, if the chairman has time at the end, can he elaborate more on the statement, politics is concentrated economics? That is a profound statement, especially in the context of preconditions and the colonial virus.
Well, the reality is that there is this assumption, especially in the African community, but I think it's commonly held by a lot of people, that somehow that there is such a thing as politics that unto itself. What we're saying is that all politics represent economic interests. So we say politics is concentrated economics, except the problem that we have as colonized people is not to have access to our own economy, generally speaking. So our politics usually reflect the interests of our oppressors, the colonial oppressors. Now what we are doing is our politics, that is to say of the African People's Socialist Party, and through the party, the African nation, is a reflection of the economic interests for self-determination, to liberate the forces of production, the land, the instruments of production, the people with the ability to produce. That's colonialism, keeps us from having access to that. So now we have our politic reflects the interests of our people to liberate those productive forces so that we can become a self-determining people. And that's what we fight for. And when you look at the US and the other imperialist powers, all of the politics, everything represent their economic interests. It's concentrated economics. It does not stand someplace up in the sky above the interests of real social forces and human beings. Uhuru, I hope that's helpful. I can't hear you. You're muted. Yeah.
I'm supposed to be the expert. Uhuru, thank you so much. So the next question comes from Morty in Richmond, Virginia. He asked, Uhuru, Chairman,
can you hold that question just for a minute? I think that was a really important question by Comrade Nasir. Because we have people who say they represent the interests of African people. And the fact is, you can see no evidence, no material evidence of what it is that they say they believe in or what it is that they say they're fighting for, generally speaking. Or the material evidence of who they are, what they believe in, can be seen to their connection to the Democratic Party or the Labor Party or some other white-controlled institution, and sometimes integrated institution. But we say that if you have a politic or if you have an ideology, a theory, it needs to be able to be represented in a material way in the real world. What the hell are people fighting for? What, if you got a politic that is about simply integrating into America, it is a capitalist politic. It is a politic of capitalism. I don't care what you call it. I don't care how leftist you might characterize yourself. The African-American people's groups that are fighting for integration, whether it's radical integrationism, and that's what it is. If you're not talking about revolutionary overturning of the relationship that we have to white power, it is connected to the ongoing continuation of colonial domination of African people. That is the politic that you are promoting. And that is the economic interest that you are promoting. So we say that politics is concentrated economics. And that's why the most successful of our and enduring of our organizations have been those organizations that have united the struggle for economic development, control of our own economy with whatever it was we were doing, whether it was Marcus Garvey, whether it was the original Nation of Islam, whether in some ways even the different kind of so-called survival programs of the Black Panther Party, a major attractor to African people who recognize concretely that you're just pie in the sky dreaming as long as you're running around talking about you're going to do this and want to be that, and there's no economic foundation. There is no component there that's connected to feed, clothing, and housing ourselves as a people. There is a direct relationship there, and politics is nothing but concentrated economics, and that's what's really important for us to understand. So I want to thank Nasir for that intervention. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Thank you, Chairman. So back to the question from Morty in Richmond, Virginia asked, Uhuru, Chairman, could you speak to the reports? And I know we talked about this, maybe it was last week, we talked about this a little last week, but could you speak to reports of mistreatment of Africans in China being blamed for COVID-19? What does it mean for our future relationship with the Chinese?
Our future relationship with the Chinese depends on our ability to take Africa for ourselves. Our success as African revolutionaries. There's no shortcut to that. And that's what our commitment has to be. Our future relationship with China should be based in part on the fact that China has to deal in an equitable fashion with Africa and would have to be concerned about the consequences from Africa for any mistreatment of African people. And I'm saying this about China, but the fact of the matter is the mistreatment of African people in what we call America has no consequences either. Africa is weak. It does not have the leadership of the African working class having come to power, even in a serious contention for political power. Otherwise, the United States would have to answer to Africa for its treatment of Black people here or any other place around the world. So I'm not confused about this. The Chinese are just like other people. that they are superstitious and can be as superstitious and irrational as Africans can in this country, who were brutalized and not go to Chinese restaurants because they're afraid of China's relationship to COVID-19, because they bought into the lie that's being pushed by the United States and other imperialist powers that are involved in a political and economic struggle for supremacy against China. So if you're reading about this, it is likely because the US and the capitalists and the imperialists who are fighting with China want you to read about this. And so I am concerned as about the treatment of African people, whether it's in China or any other place in the world. But I know the response to that, we can condemn China and its mistreatment, and we should condemn any mistreatment of African people anywhere. But our responsibility is to take power so that it's impossible for China or any other force on the planet to mistreat African people without some kind of consequence. And that's what our objective has to be. Otherwise, it's just a form of opportunism that allows us to go off on China. But, you know, you're talking about what happened to African people in China. What the hell is happening to African people in England? What the hell is happening to African people in Ireland? What the hell is happening to African people in Belgium and all these other damn places that we're talking about? So suddenly China becomes the boogeyman because it mistreats African people. China is late in the game. It's late in the game if it's involved in that. So that's what I have to say about it. Fight for Black power. Join the movement of the African People's Socialist Party. Join the power of the African working class as it's expressing itself through the African People's Socialist Party and the African Socialist International, Uhuru. Thank you for that question, brother. It's a very important question because it's the one that's rolling the social media, the internet. Every time I look up, I'm seeing China is doing something. And that means to me, in part, that the US and the imperialists are quite successful in taking our eyes off the real criminals that's experts at mistreating Black people, and that's renowned around the world, or was once world renowned for its mistreatment of Black people. China's catching up if it's involved in it at all. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you, Chairman. And you have all these neo-colonial stooges like in Africa who are kicking out China, and, you know, while US imperialism is, you know, the puppets of the puppet maestros behind the neo-colonial stooges. Uhuru, thank you so much for that, Chairman. We had a comment from Comrade Malika, who is the Midwest Regional Representative of the African People's Socialist Party in St. Louis, says, Uhuru, Chairman, we salute you and your leadership, which continues to raise our consciousness on what it means to be a part of a revolutionary organization. APSP continues to shape history as we keep the struggle of African people on every front as the focal point. No surrender, no compromise.
Uhuru.
Uhuru. William Duke in Atlanta, Georgia asks, under the motto, politics is concentrated economics, what is the party's economic blueprint regarding land reform or land ownership for our people?
Well, when you say our people, I'm hoping you're talking about Africans, and that's a really complicated question. In places like Colombia, for example, the government has retracted its grants of land to African people there as some kind of compensation due to our enslavement. In the United States, of course, we know the government retracted any promise that was once associated with the notion of 40 acres and a mule. And our movement has often, at one time, revolved around the question of having land, and to the point that the original Nation of Islam demanded land of our own, etc. The land question has always been a critical question for us. And what we're saying in the party, the African People's Socialist Party, and of course we struggle wherever we are in defense of the rights of the people, to our people, to have some kind of stability and control of land. We believe in the control of land because the revolution itself is one that revolves around the capture of territory. You can't make a revolution without capturing territory itself, or for however you see that representing itself in the world strategically. So in St. Louis, for example, we engage in a serious land reclamation movement and have captured land. We've transformed, and it may seem insignificant to those who don't know St. Louis and don't understand some aspects of the struggle we're involved in as a people, but in St. Louis alone, we have transformed an entire block in a desolate community that has been put there, that has been put in conditions for a permanent perennial degradation, but not only housing stock in a permanent state of a deterioration, but the African population are being starved out. The social relations that we enjoy in that community are horrendous. And this is how we were trapped in that, but we've transformed that community. We've raised the morale of a whole city of St. Louis. We've turned the whole city, African community of St. Louis around just with that project that we have there in terms of land reclamation and transformation of the conditions of the people and bringing the people into the process of changing the conditions. Go to Black Power Blueprint, I think it is .org, and you can get a sense of just in St. Louis. But that's just one aspect. If you come to St. Petersburg, Florida, you see the Uhuru House there that is located in a place that before this gentrification process began, it was like a model in terms of development there. There's a radio station there that we created. There is a market space there. There's a commercial kitchen there, economic activity there. So we're talking about trying to acquire land, and we are engaged in a real serious struggle for the acquisition of land. But to the extent that we are really successful is community ownership of the land, either through the party of our institutions or either through collective kinds of relationship we can develop among the people for that acquisition. But ultimately, the real prize that the entire world, every capitalist country, every imperialist power, every wannabe imperialist power in the world is concentrating on Africa. Africa is where you see all of the colonial and wannabe colonial powers, the imperialist power, concentrated. They're either fighting for their lives in Africa or they're coming to Africa to create economic success for themselves. And that's our Africa. And that's the land that we really have to be dealing with, because that is fundamental to our oppression and exploitation as a people, that the actual stuff of the land, African land, our national homeland has been under assault now for more than 600 years. But the 600 years that is responsible for the advent of capitalism, colonial capitalism, is what I'm really concentrating on when I say for 600 years. When Portugal, 600 years ago, initiated the capture of African people and began this process of dispersing us all around the world, so that we will be asking a question about land in the United States, about what is our program for land in the United States, while Africa, which has been taken from us and is being ruthlessly taken from us, even as we have this discussion where millions of African people are in concentration camps called refugee centers, are being forced by desperate conditions to try to cross the Mediterranean, drowning and otherwise being wiped out. That's our Africa. That has to be the strategic objective of anything we do that's related to the question of land and land acquisition and development. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Thank you, Chairman. So we had another comment from Nasir. Says, the point that imperialism was determined to not just crush the revolution, but also the spirit of the people. I think that is what Assata Shakur was speaking to at the ending of her book. There was no doubt about it. Our people would one day be free. The cowboys and bandits didn't own the world. I appreciate the chairman's meticulous analysis. So there's
the first words that Assata Shakur, who, by the way, sent me an invitation to visit her in Cuba. It was a sort of private message, so I guess it's all right to say that. But before I could get there, the U.S. government had placed a bounty on her head to $1 million, and then that was followed by the Obama regime, and et cetera. So Assata had to go underground in Cuba, and the contact that I had that brought me that message has since died. But the first word that she was in the message that she sent, somebody should read that, was Uhuru. All roads lead to Uhuru.
Uhuru. Uhuru. So there's one question, and it kind of, I'm going to do like a little background of it. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries.
OPEC.
OPEC. Okay. All
Mhm.
right. So somebody asked, can you speak to the battle between OPEC and OPEC Plus, which for our viewers just want to say that countries that belong to OPEC include Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. And plus the United Arab Emirates, Libya, Algeria, and Nigeria. So I don't know if you could speak to that, Chairman.
Well, I don't know. I can't speak to it with too much intelligence, but I can say that for a while now, Saudi Arabia has dominated OPEC, at least formally dominated OPEC. I say formally because even though Saudi Arabia was a place that was considered at one juncture having the largest oil reserve, petroleum reserve on the planet. That's not, it's not necessarily considered the same today. It had a lot of juice and a lot of influence. But, you know, it's formally that way, but the Saudis' monies and resources were tied up in US banks and other kinds of financial institutions. That's just the objective reality. So, it was able, and the US had a powerful influence in terms of shaping what oil prices would be. The US had a real strategic interest in being able to control that area of the world, Saudi Arabia. You got to remember too, Saudi Arabia is a creation of the imperialists themselves. They created Saudi Arabia in part because of the oil and being able to control the petroleum there. And so the US had a real strategic interest. That's one of the things that made Israel successful, important to the United States. To control that area of the world, Israel functions as, you know, as a sort of a forward military base of U.S. imperialism to help control the Arabs and other people and the Iranians, et cetera. In one juncture, Iran was a part of that base through the Shah that we just mentioned earlier on. So it was important for the United States to control it. If you control that, you didn't just control the people and countries in the Middle East, you also control much of the world. Japan, China, Europe, et cetera, all relied on the resources, oil resources coming from there. And so, but there's been, you know, this fight among thieves, especially most recently. And I can't remember the specifics of the struggle that emerged where Saudi Arabia turned on one of its allies, I can't remember, but there's been this war that's happening. And then what the United States was successful in doing was to affect the price of petroleum in a very negative way as it relates to Russia, Iran, Venezuela, the three forces that it was in contention with on a world scale that were major petroleum producers. So the United States, through Saudi Arabia, actually depressed the price of oil so that it would depress the amount of monies coming into the coffers, the treasurers of Iran, Russia, Venezuela, which were countries that were dependent on oil. And in the face of doing that, because the United States control was the world economy effectively, and the US dollar, of course, is the primary reserve currency in the world, then that were able to see that the Russians, the Iranians, and the Venezuelans could not trade with anybody else, so that they cut off the petroleum resources, then they could affect in a very powerful way the economy and therefore the politics in Russia, in Iran, in Venezuela, as a part of the process of neutralizing them and doing regime change, et cetera, creating problems and hostilities within those countries. And so that's what they were able to do. And so that struggle is an ongoing struggle with different kinds of ramifications. It didn't just affect Venezuela, for example, it affected Cuba, that relied on Venezuelan oil. Petroleum. So it was, it was a really powerful and strategic impetus. But the thing is that it undermined ultimately the Saudi economy itself. So the Saudi economy has been suffering. The Saudis have been able to manipulate the prices of oil, petroleum for a while now. But Russia, which had adhered to the OPEC pricing, because the whole world was just doing what Saudi Arabia wanted to do, but Russia had created a pretty serious kind of reserve in terms of economic or financial reserve, so that when Saudi Arabia tried to hold the prices at a certain level to its benefit, Russia said, we're not adhering to that. Down, and so push the prices of petroleum down. That's not why you can go to a service station now and find gasoline for less than $2 a gallon, because Russia did that. When Russia did that, its objective in part was to destroy the shale industry in the United States that allowed the United States to even remove itself from the pressures of the petroleum, interests, et cetera. And that's been a real serious contradiction. So Saudi Arabia has a problem now. As quiet as it's kept, it has a problem. It affects its ability to do what it's been doing with U.S. In Yemen and other places now. Their resources are drying up. There are contradictions even within the Saudi regime itself. This incestuous regime that they have created. So I probably didn't speak directly to what the comrade just mentioned, but those are the kinds of things that I'm immediately familiar with, and not as familiar as I should be, because I've forgotten the country that Saudi Arabia attacked, the so-called country that Saudi Arabia attacked, and began tried to make it an outcast within that region, although it had essentially been a lapdog or really in bed with the Saudis up until that point. Uhuru. It's another one of those fake royal, families that we're talking about.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah. So we are coming, getting close to the time, and I did want to take just one more question, and this is, well, I'm going to kind of just summarize, I think, the point that they that should be made, and is that, like the African People's Socialist Party and our presence in Africa and the work we're doing on the ground in Africa, and to because somebody's I guess comment is that African economics in the diaspora should plug into the drive for Africa, and that the Chinese and Europeans and others have been on the scramble for Africa for decades, which we've always said that everybody has an Africa plan. We have to have an Africa plan. So, that's the person's, discussion, like, we have to be focused on Africa. And I wanted to know if you could just kind of expound on how the party has been, doing that. And that is, something
the party's philosophy is meaningless without Africa. Africa is our national homeland. The contradictions we suffer any place in the world, including Africa itself, is a consequence of African people first, Africa coming under assault, as I mentioned, more than 600 years ago. Africa being deprived of the labor and genius of millions, scores of millions of African people who were shuttled off forcibly at gunpoint to other parts of the world. And Africa is central to our philosophy. You've got people in different parts of the world who are trying to become Afro-Germans, who are trying to become Afro-Brits, and who, Afro-Swedes and all these other things. Which diffuses the power, of the African Revolution. It's a way that somehow Africans, in some instances, have forgotten, or sectors of the population have forgotten, what it is that we're fighting for. In the United States, you got some kind of the most, I'm convinced, entity that's created by the intelligence organization of American descendants of slave, or African descendants of slave, or something other kind of nonsense like that. Or you've got this stuff like the 5 staters. Our national homeland is Mississippi and Alabama and Texas, and well, not Texas, but these entities, like et cetera. So the consciousness of African people has been under assault for a long period of time. But for us, Africa is the critical question. And this is because the African working class now can only rise up and overturn the social system. And it's our historic mission as a class that's dispersed around the world. This is the real Achilles heel of the whole capitalist system, the fact that they took all these African workers and dispersed us all around the world. And we have a common interest in overturning this relationship, and Africa is central to that. So we don't talk about Africa as just something. It is central. If we don't have Africa in the center, then we have nothing. Not only do we as a party, but we as a people, and certainly the African working class, has no future at all. So when we have enough space, and when we are located in particular places in the world, that we can concentrate our energies and use the infrastructure that's created by the imperialist power through our labor as African people here, and through our resources as African people around the world, we have a responsibility to start building as we can. And that's what we've been doing. All the economic entities all the experiences that we've achieved belong to Africa. And we intend to take Africa back. Africa must become again in the possession of African people. And that means that we do not expect for imperialism or Chinese intervention or Russian intervention or Portuguese intervention or any other force to be able to determine the future for Africa. We will do that ourselves. That's what we're building. That's why we're building in the shanty towns, in the townships in South Africa, and in the most oppressed sectors of the African population around the world. Africa belongs to African people, and we have to create an African economy. And we've taken resources that Africans have brought to the Americas, that have brought to other places around the world, and we are pooling those resources, and we are now transforming these resources and giving them back to Africa with all of the expertise that we've achieved wherever we've been located. Africa's ours. And so the African working class now is on the ascendancy through its own Vanguard party, its own party of the African working class, Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you so much, Chairman. That was excellent, and just a brilliant way to bring us to the conclusion of this study. So again, just want to salute our leadership. Thank you so much, Chairman. And because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question was not answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the chairman does see your question. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, winning the war of ideas. For more revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune into Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. Did you unite with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. No matter where you are in the world, you can join the African People's Socialist Party. So go to apspuhuru.org. Order your copy of Chairman Omali Yeshitela's latest book, Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress at burningspearmarketplace.com. That was the text that we were just studying today. So make sure you cop your copy of Vanguard at burningspearmarketplace.com. So we have a list of incredible events that you can continue the deepening of the understanding of African internationalism and everything that our party is doing. You have the ability today to tune into several different events and keep up with us, throughout the weeks, because we have an event going on just about every single day throughout our entire movement. So today, at 8 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Central, 11 a.m. Eastern. So following this, the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement is holding a webinar aimed at arming the people with revolutionary ammunition to charge genocide against the U.S. government. And the keynote speakers will be our very own Chairman Omali Yeshitela, leader of the African Nation and founder of the Uhuru Movement, Louisa Kinshasa, Secretary General of the African Socialist International, Dr. Aisha Fields, the director of the All African People's Development and Empowerment Project and chair of the Black COVID-19 Commission. Penny Hess, the chairwoman of the African People's Solidarity Committee, and Dr. Matsamela Odom, chair of the Africans Charge Genocide Campaign. And you can sign the petition, africanschargegenocide.org. Again, you do not want to miss that. That's happening at 11 a.m. So grab some breakfast, grab some food, and come right back for that dynamic discussion. And also today, beginning at 1 p.m., the African National Women's Organization is hosting a Harriet's Daughter study group and book club discussing former Black Panther Party leader Elaine Brown's book, A Taste of Power. The purpose of the Harriet's Daughter Study Group and Book Club is to engage with African women in exploring literary themes that explain, explore, and provide strategies to overturn the oppression leveled against African people, particularly as it relates to us as African women. The books chosen by the HG Book Club may or may not represent the position of the African National Women's Organization. And this event is hosted on Zoom, and participants are required to register. So if you are interested in tuning in today, you need to register quickly, and you can access the registration details at theburningspear.com under the events tab. Tuesday, May 5th from 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, learn about Uhuru Furniture and Collectibles and the worldwide African independent liberated economy that they are a part of in a webinar theme, Support and Defend Uhuru Furniture, Not the Banks and Wall Street. Again, that's taking place on May 5th from 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern. Registration can be found at theburningspear.com under the events tab or on the Uhuru Furniture Collectibles Philadelphia Facebook page. UFC has served the community for 26 years in Philadelphia and 31 years in Oakland, California. It is a project of the African People's Education and Defense Fund, the nonprofit that's transforming and uplifting the lives of our people by building an independent economy in our own hands, or as we say, the baddest nonprofit on the planet. The Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations will host its 4th annual electoral campaign school on June 13th and 14th. Registration details for this event will be made available on blackisbackcoalition.org. The African National Women's Organization has the African National Women's Organization's Black Women's Convention themed Sisters United for the Revolution is scheduled for July 10th through the 12th, and registration details can be found at anwouhuru.org. That's anwouhuru.org. And we are calling on people to follow closely the All African Peoples Development and Empowerment Project on Facebook or visit developmentforafrica.org for important information and helpful tips in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru.